Good afternoon, and I'm pleased to have everyone join us in the subcommittee hearing of the Government Reform and Oversight Committee. This is our first Government Operations Subcommittee hearing. Delighted to have the opportunity to chair. This is my third subcommittee to chair in Government Reform and Oversight, formerly Government Operations Committee. Had the honor of serving as chairman of the Civil Service Subcommittee for 4 years, Criminal Justice and Drug Policy for 2 years, and now have an opportunity during this period, and I think most important responsibility during this period of time, the next couple of years, particularly when our nation faces some challenges with finance, with financing government. Tomorrow we face sequestration and physical crisis, that we can be in a position to examine some of the areas in which we can save taxpayer dollars, do a better job, and also hopefully help towards that bottom line when we're approaching a $17 trillion national deficit. So pleased to call the committee subcommittee hearing to order today. Mr. Connolly, hopeful to be here in a few minutes. I want to thank the staff on both sides of the aisle for working in a cooperative, bipartisan manner to launch our effort, and we look forward to continuing that effort. Exercise. This uncovering government waste, abuse, and fraud is not a partisan issue. It's something that we have a solemn responsibility to pursue, and particularly under the charter of this important committee. With that being said, too, try not to offer any surprises. I told Mr. Connolly, and I'll recite publicly, we'll do our first field hearing as tentatively scheduled next Friday in Miami, Florida. It'll be at Miami-Dade Community College. It will also be on the subject that we'll cover some of today here, and that's a subject of failures in managing federal real property. Billions in losses is the title of today's hearing, but we'll continue that with a hearing. I come here today also having chaired the Transportation Committee, and just for the record, began work. And in transportation, we have a very limited focus over some of GSA's federal property activities, and we began some hearings, as you may recall, both looking at GSA operations, the guy in the hot tub who everyone remembers waving at us while he was wasting extreme amounts of taxpayer money on expensive conferences. But we also uncovered federal assets that were not utilized, including looking in the Washington area at the old post office, which I'm pleased we have a plan for. It's moving forward. Instead of losing $10 million a year, it has the potential for income for the taxpayers, instead of being a pit where folks don't work and we pour money into it. As many as 1,000 workers will work there, possibly as much as a 400-room hotel. So we can take these assets that are costing taxpayers money and convert them into performing assets and reduce, again, our deficit spending. We also looked at the Cotton building, which is between the interstate and the mall, a huge property, smaller building, but it's sat idle. The power station, 2 acres right behind the, I believe it's the Ritz-Carlton in Georgetown, vacant power plant on very valuable property sitting idle. And our hearing next week in Miami is a continuation of a hearing, because we did one in an empty federal courthouse, which has been vacant, I believe, since 2007. And after we did the hearing, we found out that federal property sitting idle across the street from the community college. In fact, the community college had been seeking for some 6 years access to either rent or utilize that space. They needed additional classroom, particularly in a judicial setting for some of their programs, and it's exactly across the street. So next Friday, one of our key witnesses will be the president of that college, and he'll detail some of his efforts to acquire over many years an idle federal asset. So we're trying to pick up from where we've been and where we're going, we intend to go. Today's hearing will focus primarily, and I'm stalling for a minute, as you can tell, try to get give Mr. Connolly time to get here. But today's hearing, we're going to focus on high-risk property issues that have been identified and by GAO as high risk. And unfortunately, the category of high-risk activities of the federal government was submitted again, I believe, last month. And again, and I guess this is the 10th anniversary of appearing high on the high-risk category list, is the issue of real federal property and problems with management losses and risk involved there. So this is the 10th anniversary of appearing on that list. And what we thought we'd do is start out with reviewing some of the problems that have been identified, and I think the GAO's done a good job in identifying some of the problem areas. Then we'll review some cases to expand what we did in the capital area. We looked at a couple of properties in the last 30 days since we acquired this responsibility, but we wanted to look at in the neighborhood first, then we'll look across the country. And we look particularly at two properties I'll talk about in a few minutes. But again, I'm pleased to have Mr. Connolly as a ranking member and look forward to working with him. We've had a good start discussion, and again, I appreciate the cooperation of his staff and the ranking member personally in helping us launch this. So as we begin this hearing today, again, Mr. Connolly and staff, I have to reiterate our very basic fundamental principles of our activity, and it's first that Americans have a right to know how their money in Washington is taken from them and how it is spent, and making certain that it is well spent. And secondly, that Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. And I know Mr. Connolly joins me in trying to uphold those principles. Our duty on this committee, the Government Reform and Oversight Committee and the specific subcommittee, is to protect these rights of the citizens. They're out working hard, sending their hard-earned taxpayers to Washington. They send us here to represent them, and that's what we need to do. So we've got to hold government accountable for the taxpayers, and we also have to find out what's going on, make that public, and the public has a right to know what the government is doing and what they get from their hard-earned dollars coming here. We'll work tirelessly in a partnership with our citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring them genuine reform to the bureaucracy. Now, just having this hearing or just talking about some of the problems gets us absolutely nowhere. So, it's my hope this can be an action-oriented subcommittee. Work with Mr. Connolly again in a bipartisan effort to find solutions, either legislative or working sometimes with agencies to get things moving. And then let me just cover for a moment again the continuation of the work I started before and we're entering into, and we picked up here in the Washington area. And I'm not just picking on the nation's capital, Virginia or Maryland. We will go to Florida. We can go anywhere in the United States and see these abuses. But real property management that the federal government has responsibility over is 77,000 buildings that have been identified as vacant or underutilized. 14,000 of these buildings and structures have been declared excess property, and the federal government spends $1.67 billion annually to operate and maintain vacant or underutilized properties. And here in our backyard, again, we looked at two examples, and we've got some illustrations here. Agricultural Research Center, and we went out to that facility in Beltsville, Maryland. These photographs on the side were taken by our staff. If you look, this is, what is that, the Federal Drug Administration building is the first building. We'll identify, it looks sort of varnished. That has its title on the door. Next to it, you only see building 262 and 263. There's a line of these office buildings, totally vacant, vines growing over them. You see some of the interior. This is part of a nearly 7,000-acre Department of Agricultural Research Services Center. Covers nearly 7,000 acres. It's just an enormous swath of land. In fact, it's bigger than the city territory in my state of Key West. That's how big it is. In some of the most valuable real estate in the United States of America, it's part of the Capital District. So there are over 500 buildings here, and over 200 of them are vacant or underutilized. In all fairness, most, well, I'd say more than half, probably 150, are small, outdated, some of them even shed buildings. But there are 40 buildings that are of a significant size. You see these here, sitting there idle. The interesting thing was I asked when they'd seen a member of Congress, and I think it's in Mr. Hoyer's district or one of the Maryland members, and they said they had seen him and maybe a senator, but they'd never seen another member of Congress, at least in recent memory, come there. So my concern is this asset, which is incredibly valuable, this valuable piece of real estate that could be better utilized. I'm not trying to do away with agricultural research services, but a lot of this facility was built in the 30s, and their mission has changed. But we have no plan. We have no plan. We have no one looking at coming forward with utilization or maximizing these assets. And then one of the other things we found in the GAO found in this high-risk report is some of the reports, we keep an inventory of reports of property, and they found the data and data quality of property was inconsistent and inaccurate. And they don't collect the data. It's garbage in, garbage out. Here's an illustration of two properties on the list, a Federal Real Property Profile, listed in excellent condition. You see the report there? And you can see where they are. One, the roof is caved, the other one is decrepit. In a recent GA audit, they found the inconsistencies and inaccuracies of 23 of 26 locations visited contained in the Federal Real Property Profile. So we're only scratching the surface of some of the problems that we have. We're here to uncover that, to look at how we can do a better job in alleviating some of the problems in dealing with either excess or current Federal property, and then the data and information that we have about them. Don't have time to go into visiting 1 million square feet in a property. I don't know if that's in your district, Mr. Conley, but the utilization of that space, prime real estate in the capital region that someone should be looking at for its maximum and best use. So with those comments, and I will add a lot more, I'm just, again, just getting started. Thank you for being late, because it gave me more time to mouth off here. But let me just say, I appreciate, I've worked with Mr. Conley before on projects important to his district and the region. I was delighted to see that he's the ranking member, and we've had great discussions and preliminary work in launching our effort. And I welcome him. I'm pleased to recognize him at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize for being late. I had 3 luncheon meetings all over the Capitol compound, and so I did not eat at all 3, but so forgive me for being a little bit late. But I do want to thank you so much for holding this hearing, and I absolutely pledge to work with you on the subject. I think it's a very important subject. When I was chairman of Fairfax County, This was a very personal subject to me because of the disposition of the Lorton prison site, federal prison, going back to very early 1900s. Historic site. The suffragettes were actually imprisoned there for protesting the lack of vote for women. And it was at one point seen as a model sort of penal reform institution. It evolved into something quite ugly. It was about slightly under 3,000 acres. And we were able to purchase it from the federal government as excess property with certain pledges about what we would do with it. But when we got the property, we had over 300 buildings on this one property site, to your point, Mr. Chairman, some of which looked like that, some of which were historic buildings that we had to preserve. We had agreed to preserve, many of which had asbestos that had to be abated. And, of course, if a building ends up looking like that, Mr. Chairman, the only choice is to bulldoze it. You can't, it's just too expensive to try to retrofit it or reconstruct it. So allowing buildings to get into that kind of decrepitude has a cost associated with it, and there's a public safety issue at some point in terms of this kind of condition of buildings. The maintenance alone, it's estimated on buildings that we no longer need or use, is over $1.7 billion a year, according to the GAO. So there are lots of costs into all of this. And what I'd like to work with you on, Mr. Chairman, is not only the issue of disposition, but also the relationship to local governments. I know you face this too. We want to make sure that if there is a compelling use of these properties at the local level, that they get sort of first right of refusal, because it's in their midst, and we, as the federal government, have a responsibility and partnership to that community. So sometimes the highest, best use of a property from a pure dollars and cents point of view may not always be in sync with what the local government's priorities may be, but I would never want to just run roughshod over the local governments. I know you and I talked about an example back home in Florida where we would want to look at the productive use of a particular property for an educational institution. So my own experience gives me a lot of sensitivity to what you are trying to do here, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to working with you and collaborating with you as we work through these issues, particularly in light of sequestration and the sort of fiscal cloud that now hangs over all of us. It behooves all of us to look for every opportunity to try to make sure that the assets we do manage, we're managing efficiently, and those that we no longer need and know we no longer need, instead of always mothballing them, maybe we need to dispose of them in a productive way that serves the taxpayer and the local community well. With that, I look forward to the hearing and the testimony this afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you so much. And we, again, will be focusing today on the high-risk series, GAO's publication, and in particular, we're going to be looking at federal real property management. And we are pleased that we've got 3 witnesses. We have members, some in a conference and some at other activities, but all members, with your permission, may have 7 days to submit opening statements for the record without objection. Without objection. So ordered.
Mr.
Yes.
Chairman, I'm sorry, I was derelict. I would ask, without objection, that our colleague Eleanor Holmes Norton be allowed to participate in this hearing when she arrives.
Without objection, she'd be more than welcome.
I would further ask, Mr. Chairman, consent to enter into the record a statement of the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty on this subject.
Without objection, so ordered.
I thank the
all
Chair.
Statements, any statements, and lengthy statements, we try to limit you to 5 minutes, our witnesses, but our panel can submit lengthy statements. Now, I don't see it here, but it's customary to, I think in the past, to swear our witnesses in. So if you would stand, raise your right hand. Do you solemnly, raise your right hand, do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give to this panel of Congress is the whole truth and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative, and welcome. We're pleased to have 3 top-notch witnesses, and we can begin by a quick introduction. We have Dorothy Robine as the Commissioner of Public Buildings Service at General Services Administration. Mr. David Wise is the Director of Physical Infrastructure Team at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. And we have Mr. Leonard Gilroy. He's the Director of Government Reform at the Reason Foundation. So we've got three excellent witnesses. And what we're going to do, we'll give you 5 minutes to sort of launch into it. Now, I might say that you'll probably hear a bell ringing in a few minutes, and that'll be a 15-minute warning. I'm sure we could get through the three of you. Then we may have to come back and ask questions. There'll be about but probably a 45-minute delay for us to go and vote and come back, from what I understand. So with that, let me recognize the Commissioner of Public Buildings, Dorothy Roby, and welcome her. You're recognized.
Good morning, Chairman Mica. Thank you, and Ranking Member Connolly. It's an honor to be here with you this morning. Under new leadership, GSA has refocused on its mission of delivering the best value in real estate acquisition and technology service to government and the American people. In the real estate area, we face three key challenges. One, an aging portfolio of buildings. Second, limited capital for reinvestment in those buildings. And third, because of the first two issues, an over-reliance on leased space as opposed to government-owned space. To meet these challenges, GSA is focusing its effort in four key areas. First, we are right-sizing our portfolio. We're working with federal agencies to improve their utilization of space and thereby reduce their space requirement. We do this by, among other things, helping agencies adopt newer, more efficient workspace arrangements and undertake proper planning for mobile work. One indication of our success is our FY13 prospective level leases, which were reduced in size by 300,000 square feet, or about 10%. Second, we are disposing of excess GSA property. Mr. Chairman, I know this has been a particular interest of yours, and I appreciate the visibility you have given the issue. You will be pleased to know that the online auction to dispose of the Georgetown heating plant has been underway since late January. Although the auction was scheduled to end last week, we have kept it going because of continued bidding activity. As of a half hour ago, the high bid is $16.1 million. With our government-wide disposal authority, we've also been working to help other agencies dispose of unneeded assets. In FY12, we disposed of 114 federal properties. Of those, 79 were sales that yielded about close to $38 million in proceeds. However, as GAO has noted, there are a number of longstanding challenges to getting agencies to better utilize their current inventory and dispose of unneeded assets. The key ones are the upfront cost of property disposal, legal requirements prior to disposal, and stakeholder resistance. As you know, the Administration has proposed a civilian BRAC process that would address these challenges. I've been involved in the BRAC process since 1993, off and on, most recently during a 3-year tenure at the Defense Department. It's a painful but critically important mechanism, and we need it on the civilian side. I very much appreciate the effort by you and Congressman Denham to get a civilian BRAC bill. I would like to work with you to get a bill that goes even farther. Third, GSA is using the authorities Congress has given us to leverage private capital to deliver better and more efficient space to our federal customers. In early December, we issued an RFI, request for information, seeking private sector input on exchanging the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover building, an outdated but valuable property on Pennsylvania Avenue, for the construction of a new state-of-the-art headquarters somewhere in the National Capital Region.
Preferably in Northern Virginia.
We are following a similar approach to capitalizing on our assets in Federal Triangle South, a 22-acre, 5-building area near the National Mall that we think can be redeveloped so as to better accommodate Federal agency needs and at the same time support the District's vision for vibrant mixed use. Finally, we're working with OMB and the Federal Real Property Council to improve the Federal Government's inventory of real property, the Federal Real Property Profile, or FRPP. Although I would defend the quality of the data in the FRPP on our own property, on GSA-owned property, I recognize the broader limitations of the inventory. In line with GAO's recommendations, we are working with the Federal Real Property Council to get greater consistency agency to agency, to clarify the data dictionary with additional detail that will help agencies better understand the data elements, and to tighten the requirements by removing optional data fields. In closing, let me comment on a statement in the record by in the report by the Reason Foundation that Mr. Gilroy will be discussing today. It's a good report, but the report says at one point that managing real property can be considered a mundane chore for the public servant, lacking the headline-grabbing issues of health care, energy policy, or national defense. I want to assure the Reason Foundation and you, Mr. Chairman, and you, Mr. Connolly, that GSA in no way finds the management of real property to be either mundane or a chore. It is why GSA was created. It is a mission we carry out with great passion and, I would say, with considerable skill. I look forward to working with you to enable us to perform that mission better. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, and we'll hold questions. I'll recognize Mr. Wise next, and he's Director of Physical Infrastructure Team at GAO. Welcome, and you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Connolly and members of the subcommittee, I'm really pleased to be here today to discuss Federal real property management. The Federal Government's real property portfolio includes about 400,000 owned or leased buildings located throughout the country. In 2004, the President issued Executive Order 13327 establishing the Federal Real Property Council. The Executive Order required the FRPC to work with the GSA to establish and maintain a single comprehensive database describing the nature, use, and extent of all Federal real property. The FRPC created the Federal Real Property Profile to meet this requirement and began data collection in 2005. As we have reported, despite the implementation of the Executive Order, data problems have continued and agencies face challenges managing their real property. My statement today summarizes our recent high-risk update as it pertains to Federal real property management and discusses challenges associated with excess and underutilized property, drawing on our June 2012 report. The Federal Government continues to face long-standing problems managing its real property, including an over-reliance on costly leasing and issues with excess and underutilized property. The previous and current administrations have given high-level attention to real property management. For example, in May 2011, the administration proposed legislation referred to as the Civilian Property Realignment Act to establish a framework for consolidating and disposing of civilian real property. However, neither CIPRA nor other real property reform legislation introduced in the last Congress has been enacted. The Federal Government's continued reliance on costly leasing has been an ongoing problem. The Government leases space from private landlords in the same real estate market where it owns underutilized property. In some cases, Federal agencies in the same market could consolidate into other Government-owned properties. However, agencies do not have a strong understanding of real property held by other agencies and may lack the authority or expertise to lease their own underutilized property to other Federal agencies. We have ongoing work assessing GSA's high-cost leases that we plan to report on later this year. In our June 2012 review, we found that FRPP data did not accurately describe the properties at 23 of 26 sites that we visited, often overstating the condition and annual operating costs. Our work focused on reviewing selected agency-reported FRPP data elements, including utilization, condition, annual operating costs, and value. We found that FRPC had also not followed sound data collection practices. For example, the FRPC has not ensured that agencies' data elements are consistently defined and reported, thus limiting the usefulness of FRPP data as a decision-making tool. On our site visits, we found that agencies often did not report building utilization consistently or accurately. Also, as seen in the poster boards, some properties we visited were listed in FRPP as being in excellent condition, even though they are clearly not. As for operating costs, we found data inconsistencies and inaccuracies at most sites. In some cases, officials apportion building operating costs according to square footage of an overall site. Regarding value, agencies often reported replacement costs higher than the property's actual worth because they did not take into account market or asset conditions. Additionally, according to agency officials, many excess properties do not have the potential for generating revenue for the Federal Government. Indeed, we saw more than 80 buildings on our site visits that agencies plan to demolish when they have the resources to do so. Federal agencies reviewed have taken some actions to better manage their property, including consolidating offices and reducing employee workspace. However, they still face longstanding challenges. For example, agency disposal costs can outweigh the financial benefits in the near term. Legal requirements, such as those related to conveyance, preserving historical properties, and conducting environmental remediation, can make the property disposal process lengthy and costly. Finally, stakeholder interests can conflict with property disposal or reuse plans. While multiple administrations have committed to improving real property management, their efforts have not yet fully addressed the underlying challenges that we have identified. In the June report, we recommended that OMB, in consultation with FRPC, develop a national strategy for managing Federal excess and underutilized real property. OMB did not state whether it agreed or disagreed with our recommendation. In that report, we also recommended that GSA and FRPC take action to improve the FRPP. GSA has taken action to begin implementing our recommendation related to FRPP. We will continue to monitor these agencies' efforts to implement our recommendations, which we believe are critical to addressing the challenges that have kept Federal real property management on our high-risk list. Chairman Mica, Ranking Member Conley, and members of the subcommittee, this concludes my prepared statement. I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Well, thank you again, and we'll hold questions. Let's go to Mr. Leonard Gilroy, and he's the Director of Government Reform at the Reason Foundation. Welcome, and you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Mica, Ranking Member Conley, members of the subcommittee. I'm honored for the invitation to speak today. For the record, I'm Leonard Gilroy, Director of Government Reform at the Reason Foundation. We're a nonprofit think tank that researches market-based policy and best practices for efficient and effective government. Managing real property can be a major challenge in government, with agencies often lacking their own asset monitoring and tracking systems, leading to a lack of standardization and interoperability. Without the ability to know what government agencies own, it becomes very difficult to manage those assets in the most cost-effective and efficient ways. In my written testimony, I include a link to a 2010 Reason Foundation report where we outline the case for a more robust Federal real property inventory, a central geographic information systems-based record of government-owned land and assets to serve as a tool for improved asset management and public accountability. Real property inventories offer a range of benefits. They allow public officials to assess whether public property is being used and maintained in the most efficient manner possible. Inventories can also help assess the potential value of divesting underutilized or unnecessary land or assets, which can generate revenues and lower maintenance and operation costs over the long term. Selling or leasing assets to the private sector can expand the tax base and encourage economic growth. And inventories can potentially help lower lease and maintenance costs through space consolidation and more efficient utilization. Unfortunately, the absence of a robust real property inventory presents a major challenge for right-sizing the Federal property portfolio and causes higher than necessary operating costs and maintenance responsibilities. The GAO has long noted deficiencies in Federal real property management and, as you mentioned, has designated real property management as a high-risk activity since 2003, in part due to the unreliability and limited usefulness of current data. More recently, a June 2012 GAO report found that the FRPC has not followed sound data collection practices in designing and maintaining the Federal real property profile database, suggesting that the database may not be an adequate or useful tool for describing excess and underutilized properties consistently and accurately for measuring performance and for decision-making in general. The Federal Government should take note of recent proactive steps at the State level to develop real property inventories. For example, in 2005, former Georgia Governor Sonny Perdue issued an executive order creating the State's first State Property Officer and restructuring the State Property Commission to bring overlapping multi-agency management of real estate into one portfolio with a central manager. Governor Perdue also ordered the State's first comprehensive enterprise-wide asset inventory. As a result, the State has sold off over $15 million worth of surplus assets, renegotiated leases at lower rates, and adopted uniform construction guidelines. Virginia also enacted a law in 2011 requiring the State's Department of General Services to develop a comprehensive real property inventory and an online surplus real property database. Similarly, Oklahoma enacted a law in 2011 requiring the State's Director of Central Services to publish a report detailing state-owned properties, including a list of the 5% of the most underutilized properties, the value of those properties, and the potential for purchase if sold. A separate bill passed in 2012 in Oklahoma would direct the proceeds from state asset sales to a new fund dedicated to the maintenance and repair of the state's aging buildings and properties, including the Capitol complex. Considering the nation's ongoing economic challenges, the government should take proactive steps to maximize the value of its resources, ensure efficient management, and enable private sector economic growth through asset divestiture. Real property management is not a partisan issue, nor is it an issue of spending priorities. It's an issue of good governance and fiscal responsibility. In conclusion, I commend the subcommittee for considering the need to improve federal real property management. It would represent an important step toward bipartisan, responsible stewardship of public assets and resources, and improved transparency and accountability to taxpayers. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify on this important subject, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, and we will go to questions now, and we'll divide the time up that we have. First, let me start with our report author, GAO, and one of the things that was interesting that you mentioned, I thought was problems of conveyance, and I know that there are certain statutory requirements that have been set up that are impediments. Have you given any thought, or is there any recommendation to how this should be approached? Because, for example, if we took this Department of Agriculture property and the current disposal system, it's very difficult. We have some acts, too, that have been, I mean, well-intended, passed, but also put impediments to dealing with disposal. DOD property, I think you have the McKinney Act and some other things that have to comply with. Have you given any thought, Mr. Wise, or are there any recommendations? We had a couple of pieces of legislation that were crafted that really I don't think solved the conveyance problems, but would you like to comment?
Yes, excuse me. Thank you for your question, Mr. Chairman. I don't think that it's described as an impediment per se. Rather, these are issues that are, part of the entire property system. Now, we have recommended, as I noted in my statement, that it would be, we think, very helpful if OMB would develop a national strategy for trying to address federal real property. Now, OMB by itself cannot overcome all these issues, but nevertheless, they could develop a game plan that would help set up a framework so that these can be addressed in some manner. You have a situation really where many conveyances are things that are for the public interest as well. You could take, for example, a small or medium-sized city where a building, an old courthouse may be located in a downtown facility, a downtown area. It's a very valuable piece of property. It's something that maybe the city hall is too small for the city government, and it's quite natural in many, and I think this is a process that's repeated many times around the country, that a city or a state government will then be able to consolidate some of its offices and pull back from lease space. And in that case, it is helpful for the public good.
What I'm interested in,
like
and
that.
I don't know if you or Dr. Robine can help us, but if you can cite any current statutes or impediments to conveyance, maybe supply it in the future to the committee, I think that would be helpful. I was talking with Mr. Connolly informally, and we could look at the legislation, some of which I helped craft, that had been proposed but not passed, but maybe combining that, looking at how we could give you the tools to accomplish the job, and also the agencies. We'll go to agencies and they'll, oh, you passed the law, we can't do this. But I'd be most appreciative if you could identify those, and then you said maybe possibly empowering OMB. One of the problems we have in looking at properties, and here again you have 7,000 acres right up the road, incredibly valuable property, 500 buildings. I asked, is there a plan? Does anyone have a plan in the Department of Agriculture for this property? No, they didn't. Has anyone looked? Well, there are impediments, asbestos. Yep, well, lots of old buildings have asbestos in them. Maybe they won't be used, like Mr. Conley said. When they get to that condition, they have to be torn down. But you still have a valuable real estate asset there, and redevelopment and reconstruction is nothing new, even within the Capital Beltway. But we need to be able to make that possible. I know you're sort of a service agency too, Dr. Robine, but and you're doing the best you can do. She came in, I don't know if you know this, Mr. Conley, with all the disruptions we had in GSA, and has been the building commissioner since, I guess, September, trying to pick up the pieces of an agency that was having problems. But delighted to hear, incidentally, the online auction. And here's an asset that sat there for 10 years, and now it has the potential for putting some cash in the Treasury or better utilization of that. So I thank you for those efforts. But again, I'm not sure how we approach this. If we require every agency, you can't do this all, but we may need some requirement to have a plan to someone to analyze. Now, we do have a federal reporting requirement on the property, but we see how flawed that is. Here's two properties, totally dilapidated, report on the federal property report as in excellent condition. So first, what about the plan? And then maybe Mr. Wise, you could comment about how do you require accurate data?
Well, let me speak to the disposal issue, and because I think I am a veteran of a number of backgrounds, both in the Clinton White House and at DOD. And Congressman Connolly, I led the Clinton administration effort to make base reuse more friendly to communities. It was not friendly to communities when I came in. Mr. Chairman, I don't know what Orlando's experience was with McCoy when that was closed in the mid-70s.
Our big one was the Naval Training Center.
Okay, all right.
And that was political. They had brand-new buildings, some under construction. I mean, actually under construction. And Rostenkowski had more power than McCollum at the time. So they had decrepit buildings in the Great Lakes and winter conditions. But they got to open, and we actually tore down brand-new or under construction buildings. It was almost criminal. And Orlando could sustain the economic impact of losing the training center, but it was horrible. But the thing here is we have responsibility government-wide. We want, for example,
right,
a Department of Agriculture. Somebody should have a plan.
Well, so
and how do you do that? You can't do it at all. Maybe you can go in and do some spot check and say, hey, or look at plans or kick them in the butt to make a move forward with instituting a plan. But to have 7,000 acres, larger than the size of the city of Key West in my state, sit like that with almost half the buildings decrepit, it's mind-boggling.
So I would argue that you need less a plan than a process, and that process is a civilian version of BRAC.
Okay. Well, we did some of that, and again, I think we'll look at our bill. I'm not sure, though, that we even required you've got to have someone, well, first assess what you've got, and then someone make a damn decision as to disposal, best maximum utilization of the property. And so, Mr. Wise, what do you think? Give us your opinion again on how you think we should approach this.
Well, just to elaborate a little bit of what Dr. Robine was getting to, the civilian BRAC process, the CIPRA, the bill, we actually worked pretty closely with the staff to help advise on that and comment on it. And there, by bundling properties together with a total up and down vote, required from from the Congress, I think would have helped at least, if not eliminate it, would have helped ease the process of some of the steps that are right now make it very difficult to dispose or access Federal real property. So that's one step.
Would you object to requiring each agency to have a true assessment, an evaluation plan, and then best utilization?
Well, under the executive order, each agency is required to have a plan, such a plan, and so presumably these are things that are being fed into the.
Maybe it needs to be done by law.
You mean codified?
Yes.
That's really up to the Congress, but I think that was one of the bills actually was aimed at doing that. There was a different version of that bill that also never was enacted that aimed at that as well. But I think there's a combination, as you were stating earlier, that you could get a combination of both legislation as well as administrative actions that could help harmonize some of these issues and make some progress in dealing with the property issues. The disposal one can be very tricky because there's a lot, often, as you were mentioning earlier in your statement, that it can be very costly to dispose of properties due to the environmental issues. And as you saw in Beltsville, I went out there also last year, and I had an offline conversation with one of the engineers who was responsible for some of the activities going on there, and he had mentioned it cost him almost $200,000 to knock down one of the smaller buildings there because he was dealing with 3 environmental authorities between Prince George's County, State of Maryland, and the Federal. And it's a very involved process and a very costly process. And that becomes a major challenge.
We need a way to expedite that. I'm using more of my time, but I'm going to give Mr. Connolly as much time. I just want to say in conclusion, Mr. Gilroy, thank you, and also giving us examples. I will look at those examples. Georgia, and we know, you probably know Mr. Deal, who served here. McDonald, your governor, was not here. Barry Fallon, Oklahoma, former member, and Kasich from Ohio. I think you cited 4 states that have taken initiatives. We'll look at what they've done, and maybe we can learn from them or even have them in. Mr. Connolly, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me, Mr. Gilroy, you said this should not be a partisan issue. I agree. My concern, just if I can interject, and I know the Chairman shares this, as someone who spent 14 years in local government, we don't want to do harm to local communities in our zeal to divest ourselves of properties we no longer need or want. We want to make sure that whatever action we take, it's integral with the plans of that local community. For example, it may be sometimes that there is value in parking a piece of property and not developing it, not selling it off until something else is triggered in a given local community. On the other hand, it may be the opposite. The local community may welcome that property being developed to help jumpstart, catalyze redevelopment or whatever it may be. So we want to make sure we're in sync and that we're not an outlier, because the Federal Government, frankly, is not subject to local zoning regulations and laws, and that can sometimes be problematic in terms of planning. I like to believe that the Lorton property here, the Lorton prison property, was actually a model for cooperation between the locality and the Federal Government. And well, I'll come back to this. Let me ask some questions. Inventory. Do we know, Ms. Robin, is it Robine or Robin?
Robine.
Robine, sorry. Ms. Robine, do we know how much property we own as a Federal Government?
GSA, we know, I know how much GSA property we own, yes. So I mean, for better or worse.
But there are lots of Federal entities.
Yes, we represent 10% of Federal property.
Who is the coordinating entity, going back to the Chairman's question, really, for other entities? Like this property is a Department of Agriculture property, and this is a Department of Interior property. And so are you confident that those agencies have accurate inventories as well?
No.
No.
And GSA does have a role here another part of GSA, but the Office of Government-Wide Policy oversees the FRPP, the inventory, or sets the rules for the inventory.
For the other agencies. So you play that coordinating role.
Yes, it's we're still at the stage of crawling. We're not walking yet.
Yeah.
This began.
So in that legislation that the Chairman is talking about, maybe one of the elements we got to have is to toughen up reporting requirements by the agencies to you, maybe even toughen up your coordinating role, so we actually at least have an accurate picture of what do we own as a Federal Government.
Yes. I mean, I think there are a number of ways to get at it.
Before I get to disposal and utilization, when we own property, when do we make the decision and how do we make the decision to lease space rather than go to or develop the property we own?
Well, for GSA tenant agencies, we determine what we work with them to establish a requirement, and we typically work with them to lower their requirement below what they, in terms of space, and then figure out is there own space in which that would meet that requirement, and then we look at leased space as an alternative to that. It's not our first choice, but we have increasingly relied on leased space because it's often more desirable than owned space that we're not keeping up to the level of private sector space, of commercial space.
I assume cost is a factor as well.
In what sense?
Well, you're taking into account the fact that it costs X dollars per square foot to lease a space versus perhaps retrofitting or constructing.
Yes, in that sense, very much so.
Plus, there's a location issue, and okay.
Right. Yes.
Utilization. How do we determine the best utilization of a property?
Well, utilization is it's a little bit subjective. I mean, there are criteria for how much utilization, whether a property is utilized, underutilized, not utilized at all. But property that is utilized, we think can often be better utilized. The single most powerful thing that my organization is doing now is trying to move our customer agencies to collaborative open workspace, much like what the private sector is embracing, which allows them to meet their needs with less space. If you go into a typical Federal office building, same is true for a commercial space, only a third of the people are there at any one time. They're traveling, they're engaging in mobile work. We can get by with less space if it's organized in the right way. So moving agencies to that, and agencies tend to love it. I'm a convert to it. I have no office. I have a workstation, and it's 4 feet from my deputy's workstation.
How often do we have a process regularly for revisiting the utilization?
No. Not, I mean, so we each year work with, I mean, many agencies reach out to us and want to do this, and we have an active process typically at any one time with any
But it just seems to me that if you want an action-forcing event, it's got to be on a schedule. So every 5 years we review your property or something.
Yeah, I think we're constantly reviewing. We have an asset profile for every single property that we have, leased or owned, and so we're constantly looking at that. When leases expire, when we propose,
leases,
right.
I understand, because that is an action-forcing event. But if you own this property.
Right. No, that would be, I mean, we're kind of disposal police. We love to dispose of property. If we had, I don't know why we have not reached out to USDA on something like that. But
again, I think that the criteria and the review process, including subjective review, is important. I mean, the Secretary of State, William Seward, purchased Alaska. It was roundly mocked.
Right.
Roundly disdained. Nobody thought it was a smart decision to purchase Alaska from the Russians. in hindsight, we're awfully glad Seward's Folly took place and that we banked this huge piece of land that today, of course, is mineral rich and has lots of other assets to it. So it depends on one's perspective, and one wants to have some cushion to allow one to think longer term than just the immediate value of land. But on the other hand, there's got to be some process for review of what we own. And, well, if we had a let's just make it a 5-year plan in this bill we're looking at, Mr. Chairman, then there'd be an action-forcing event. You better tell us to justify this, please. Justify why you're still banking this land in that condition and that you have no plans for it. Because if that's the answer, then someone else will have plans for it for you.
Yeah.
And I guess that's what I'm getting at, that I think you've got to have some kind of requirement in the federal family that whoever it is who owns land, you got to have a mechanism for reviewing it.
Well, so we have a pretty rigorous process for working with agencies to downsize their space requirement. That's not GSA property.
No,
that's USDA.
Don't get parochial on me now. All
okay.
right. I'm sure you're doing a great job, but we're looking at the whole federal. And that's why I asked, do you have a coordinating role that could be beefed up to force agencies to have to tell you what their plans are?
So, I start to sound like a broken record on this subject, but when I was at DOD, and again in my current role, I'm part of the Federal Real Property Council, the real property officers of the largest landholding agencies, and we're the ones who developed the civilian BRAC legislation. Senior people in federal agencies realize they need to get rid of property, but they're looking at impediments, including a lot of stakeholder interests. I mean, just to take USDA, this is a USDA property. They have properties all over the country because at one time, by statute, you had to be able to reach a USDA property on horseback within a day. Now, farmers sit on million-dollar combines and communicate on their laptop, but there is an enormous amount of USDA property that it's not underutilized, but it's like post office property. One has to rethink, do we really need this many facilities? And the key to that, I think, is a process for insulating you all from the political difficulty of doing that on a very broad scale. I don't know how else to do it on a broad scale. I think there is the will among senior people in these agencies to do it, but they need help doing it.
Yeah, I just, my own experience with BRAC, which is extensive.
Yes.
It's good that we have an action-forcing event that is very difficult to amend. It's up or down. There's some good in that. But that doesn't guarantee wise decisions. And the last BRAC round made some very unwise decisions, depending on one's point of view, about transit and about land use and the like. And so, yeah, we want to force action, but we want to make sure those are wise actions.
I won't disagree with your statement.
I have other questions as well, but my time is up, and I want to give Mrs. Norton an opportunity before I think the votes have been called, have they?
Yes, I think they're going back in. But thank you, Mr. Conley. And also, too, we will be submitting, and you want to leave the record open for a period of 3 weeks to submit additional questions without objection. So ordered. By previous unanimous consent request, which was granted, I recognize the gentlelady from the district, Ms. Norton, for 5 minutes. Welcome, and you're recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the full committee, I'm not on this particular subcommittee, but under Chairman Micah, actually, on another committee, we gave a lot of attention to this issue. Therefore, it's very frustrating to hear the piecemeal approach.
Would the gentlelady yield? Now, you weren't here when Dr. Robine spoke, but we did the hearing at at the power plant.
At the power
vacant
plant?
for a decade, I think. And she told me that the current bids on the online auction are up to $16.1 million.
That's the word I have, too.
Yeah. Well, just thank you for yielding, but I didn't know if you'd heard that.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. It looks like even without a process, as you call it, the administration, at least with the GSA with property it controls, has gone ahead, and I salute you for that. But the reason I was interested is because I was a ranking member when we had this discussion in the Transportation Committee, and I sat through a similar hearings in this committee, and two versions of civilian BRAC went to the floor and were passed. I think we would have benefited if, in the process of considering our bills, we had collaborated with the Senate, because the Senate Homeland Security Committee, it seems to me, is pretty close to us, particularly to the bill that came out of this committee, and I think that could have happened if that collaboration had gone on. So when I hear this talk about data, or see these properties, it seems to me that these annual reports on federal property management issues will remain exactly as they are and as they have been, as long as nobody is in charge. And the essential problem is, unless you want to keep going agency by agency or making you all kick up dust trying to deal agency by agency as if they had some call on federal property. It's not their property. It happens to be property in their name that they were using for specific purposes. Until we get an umbrella under which to do this, we're not going to get anywhere. Would everybody at the table agree that some sort of umbrella unit, you can call it civilian BRAC, that's not what this committee called it. It simply had the GSA and the OMB to get together and to figure it out, but they had the power to do it. Would everyone agree that Congress needs to put in place some umbrella unit that would have the statutory authority to get the data and to do the other tasks that you are now doing piece by piece, trying to extract agency by agency? Would that be useful and beneficial to deal with these annual property management problems?
Yes, I very much would applaud that. One still needs an inventory, a better inventory than we have, and an ongoing process.
Well,
but for purposes
I'm saying that you're not going to get an inventory. You're not going to get anything until somebody can say, here's a system, this is how we count. So the way you're doing inventory now, you're going to be inventoried for a long time. And then we're interested in, people know how to count, but they will count differently unless there is a unit that says, this is how we want you to count, this is a date by which we want it. So I'm taking all of that and putting it under one umbrella. Data, all of the piecemeal information that you're gathering, which I regard as just make work. And I don't know how one can continue it. We had the administration and two committees of the House on the same page on some kind of unit. Somebody needed, perhaps the administration, to take more leadership, since the House Homeland Security Committee was not that far from us. We could have had a bill out of here so that we wouldn't, the discussion I have sat in on is very frustrating, because that's not going to get us anywhere, and you all know it. And to task the GAO year after year to doing this, when there are already solutions. This is not a problem that hasn't found a solution. It is a problem where we have failed to act on a solution where we were close to, in fact, getting a solution. Somebody has to move off their duff and get us moving on these bills and get the administration to saying, look, you're close together, let's get together,
Yeah.
and let's negotiate these out and get the job done, because I find it's just boring every year to go through this same telltale when everybody knows what to do. And so subjecting you, the GSA, to criticism, and then you come back and say, okay, but we only own 10% of the buildings. You know, you are a peer agency. Not a damn thing you can do when you go to the Department of Energy and say, we want your things. You just can't get it. You can't do it from the Department of Agriculture. They're 10 times bigger than you are. You ought to say that. That's how action is forced. I like, Mr. Wise, are you from the GAO?
Yes, I am.
Well, why don't you call the question on this? I looked through your report.
Well,
And I do not see anything in your report that says, and you go and the report is very informative. But why doesn't your report take account of the fact that 2 bills were passed by this House, that the Senate got close to it, and recommend that the House proceed to see what it can do along lines that wouldn't be controversial for you to say, since you've already got agreement from the administration and the House, at least, with the Senate not that closed off, instead of just going along with the same questions that you asked before the 112th Congress, when we had gotten that far. We need a push from someone that says, you got the solution right there before you go at it.
yes. Well, if I may, you may remember a couple of years ago, there was a hearing in a very cold old post office annex. I don't think you ever took off your gloves. I know I didn't. But anyway, at that hearing, we had talked about, we commented that we thought CIPRA was a step in the right direction in terms of trying to rationalize the Federal property system. What I think you're actually asking is what can Congress, or what other steps can Congress take, to really help real property reform efforts? Well, in fact, we don't think it's absolutely necessary there be additional legislation. Rather, I think if the 2 recommendations we have from our June report, I think, lend themselves, if implemented fully, to really making big strides forward. Number 1 is encouraging AOMB to implement our recommendation for developing a national strategy, and also making the Federal real property profile more transparent and open to other agencies, who then can access it and see what's going on among each other. Right now, they keep a very close hold on it, treating it like it's, kind of
Good luck,
a
Mr.
secret.
Wise.
Okay,
Good
that's
luck with
one.
that approach.
Okay, and number 2 is, again, working with the General Services Administration to make these improvements that they have said they're planning to make to the Federal real property profile, getting everybody on the same page and helping to get the agencies to report things in a uniform way, because without proper data collection methods, you're going to continue to have a mishmash of data in the profile.
Mr. Wise, I thank you for that, and I think good luck to the GSA if they can make the agencies do that. Now, OMB would have a hard time doing it. All I'm saying is that I think your report would have been far more useful to us if you had picked up where we left off, seeing that we have such substantial agreement in the Congress, instead of going back to the same kinds of approaches that, frankly, have not proved very useful. GSA has tried to do what you're talking about, and GSA simply is no match for these larger agencies. I don't think it gets us anywhere to leave on the table where Congress is close to agreement for some kind of unit to help us get to the bottom of this. And if I may link this to another part of your report, which talks about costly leasing, I couldn't agree with you more. Now, Dr. Rubin has now 412 authority to use ground leases, lease back, in order to do something about this property. So you can talk about leasing all you want to, but the fact is that if GSA isn't pushed to use this authority, we gave this GSA this authority at least 6 or 7 years ago. Only this year are we seeing any movement toward using this authority, which would mean you could act in the way that people in the real estate business act in order to build, so when I don't see how you can talk about costly leasing without implicating GSA's unused or virtually unused authority to do something about it. GSA sees a property, and you quite correctly say the government often leases space from private landlords in the same real estate market where it owns underutilized real property without indicating that there is authority in the GSA to take that real property and use quite extraordinary authority that Congress gave it, which leads me, so that's my criticism of you, Mr. Wise, but my criticism of Dr. Robin would be, where in the world is the 412 authority on this leasing? If you've got underutilized property in a city or in a county, why aren't you using lease back or ground lease or some of your flexible 412 authority to save the government money?
I think in a word, scoring issues. We are proposing to use exchange, or
I thought the whole point of the 412 authority was to take you out of the scoring problem.
No, it's legislation does not, you can't legislate around scoring issues. Now, 412 authority provides for exchanges, and we think that that's what we think will work for the FBI headquarters in exchange of J. Edgar Hoover for construction services somewhere in the National Capital Region. We think that will work for the Federal Triangle South, although we're open to a variety of alternatives. We have, if we have innovative financing authority that we're not using, you can be pretty sure that it's because we've tried and failed to get around scoring issues.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I know.
Thank you for participating and for your interest and questions, and you raised some issues that we need to pursue. This, of course, is our first subcommittee hearing, and we are focused, of course, on the high-risk series and particularly federal real estate. And we've opened a whole host of areas that we need to pursue. Mr. Conley and I have in brief discussion. We're going to look at some of the legislation that I'd helped craft and he's interested in, see what we can do to enhance that language. We would appreciate from you your recommendations, anything statutorily, any empowering OMB or GSA that's needed. Ms. Norton raised the question of some authority has been given but nothing done. We probably need triggers to make that happen. And then Mr. Conley has also cited the sensitivity when we dispose of or deal with these federal properties to where they exist and the local and state interests that are involved and recognizing them. So a host of issues, but they have called votes. So again, I think we already got unanimous consent that we would leave the record open. We'll have additional questions to submit to you.
Mr. Chairman, could I just say one thing? Dr. Robin indicated that she wasn't using this flexible authority because of scoring. She is not talking about CBO scoring. The administration internally could deal with that scoring from OMB. So I just want to put it on the record. When we hear scoring, we mean, everybody up here thinks you mean CBO, and that's not what you mean. You mean your own scoring.
Well, OMB and CBO tend to be in lockstep on scoring issues. There are cases where it's a CBO call. There are cases where it's an OMB call.
Well,
and I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying that.
Well, when that issue was brought up, in
constraint.
fact, Mr. Conley and I did have this a brief discussion. We need to look at that, and actually our committee has jurisdiction. So if there's some question or problem or lack of proper interpretation of scoring, then we need to make certain that it's defined so that we can get the job done. So that is part of our responsibility, and fortunately it falls within the jurisdiction of our committee. So we'll be working on that. Mr. Conley?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank you. This is our first hearing of this new subcommittee.
Right.
And I think you've set a tone of collaboration, cooperation, and bipartisanship I and my staff look forward to working with you and your staff, and I think we're going to make some music together. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and we will follow up together. This is, again, just a small focus on the issue of, again, federal real property for the 10th year appearing on the high-risk report of GAO. We need to not just talk about it, do something about it, and we're both committed to that. I thank Mr. Connolly. I thank our witnesses also for being with us and the staff on both sides of the aisle for their work. There being no further business before the Subcommittee on Government Operations, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.